We're living in a very different world and culture in our world now. And it's a world and culture that's hostile to the church, and it's hostile to the Christian gospel. I wonder if that surprises you. Before, in Canada, like many colonies, if you were Christian and, my dear, if you were Anglican, you enjoyed some state privilege. No longer. In greater worldview, Christians take their place with all other religions. And if anything, the government may be slightly sympathetic to religious view in general, but not to Christian view, nor to Anglican view. And everything about media, everything about television, everything about law, everything about school, if it's state, is geared away from spiritual value the way your parents and mine brought us up in the last century. And for many of you, the kind of values that you'd want for your children, the values in which you were brought up, are no longer just about Christian morals and values. And so it means that if we want to be the church, and we want to be the church in a New Testament way, we want to be Christian church the way the Scriptures talk about church, and particularly in the early church, then we need to work at it differently. We may have to give the same good news message, for the message is the same, but we may have to give that message differently if we want people to hear it. I was at a conference, a fascinating conference, the diocesan conference this last week, and the keynote speaker, particularly inspiring chap, said, among many other wise things, for us as Anglicans, if pure church architecture, because we pride ourselves in that, and pure beautiful music alone, because Anglicans also pride themselves in that, could do it, then it would have done it by now. It would have filled the church by now. But of course, those two things alone haven't done it. It's not normal for kids today to let their mates know that they are Christians at school. I asked the teenagers that were in an admission to communion class here a few months ago, do your friends at school know that you are Christians? No, they said. Why would we tell them? And that's the reality of our world. And it's different from the world in which Granny and Grandpa were teenagers, and it's different from the world in which we would sometimes like our children to grow up. And even though we pray officially in our prayer book for the Queen, church and state have no relationship around religion at all. We call it a postmodern age. And so, if we believe that we've got something to offer as Christian people, which we do, then how we invite people into church and get them to stay in church may need to be different. This Christian community at All Saints has historically been a warm and a welcoming community, and the logo that you have written on the letterhead and on a whole lot of places is discover a place to belong. And this community has been intimate enough for people to be known, but now, because of that intimacy, but also because of natural growth, there are larger numbers of people. And so it's a little more difficult for you to know everyone. And you can't be sure that they'll call you by name. And you can't be sure that you'll remember their name when we meet on Sunday. And I wonder sometimes, has it just got to do with music and worship? Many Anglican churches have done the modern thing about worship and music, because they say, and rightly, young people don't normally buy into traditional ways of doing things. But if that was solely true, then Anglican parishes who do it differently from us, because we have a balance of styles of worship here, Anglican parishes who do it differently from us and invest only in modern kind of worship and music would be overflowing. So the question is, what is the how of helping the church grow? What is the how of healthy church? And the answer is the second of these 4 commitments that we are speaking about over these 4 weeks. Last week, commitment to God. This week, commitment to the community of church. And then commitment to my neighbor, who's that? And then commitment to generosity. So the how of helping church to be a healthy church lies in commitment to the community of the church. The foundation of that we dealt with last week, and it is, unless I have a commitment to God in Jesus for us as Christians, any work that we do for the church will become a slog. We'll tire of it. Unless the basis from which I am part of Christian community and I enter in Christian community and live in Christian community is rooted in my faith in Jesus, then the reason for which I do it may not be pure. I have to own up and say that I'm partially responsible for the fact that these sermons, and particularly this series on commitment now, are also on YouTube through the church website. So you just got to go to it, www.allsaints.ca. And then, of course, you don't have to come to church. You can just hear the sermon and see how it was. And therefore, our private family business at All Saints is now being put out to the world. And if anyone were interested, of course, if they were interested, they could look. But perhaps also a challenge for us. A challenge that your friends or your family in other parts of the world, maybe your friends right here who watch you and say, I wonder what they do there. Or I've heard them invite me, but I'm not so sure about it. Those friends can look on a website and they can call you up and say, is it true what's happening at All Saints? And you can either own up or you don't have to own up. And you can give it like it is, good and bad, because both exist in a real church body. Or you could say, well, I don't really go there much. Huh? The choice is yours. Why is it important for us as Christians to be committed to the community of the church, to the church family? Because for many people, the notion of being committed to God is understandable. The notion of being committed to my neighbor is fairly understandable. That's the second part of the command that Jesus gave, and we read and started speaking about last week. But the church family, because church, you see, doesn't always have positive connotations for everybody. If I'm going to welcome people who don't belong to church, my church, then we have to be a dependable community, dependable among us here. And we have to be that already if we're going to invite people into it. I mean, you know how it feels when the church is full of people. I've not heard anybody complaining about the church being full. It becomes a problem when the church is 85 or 90 or 95% full, and you can't actually move your arms to read the hymns, or you can't breathe properly, or whatever. That's a problem. But most people don't complain about full church. So we'd assume that those who are here want to be here, and they want to fill up the place even more. And it's not, you see, so much that we want a large congregation, or we want the bigger congregation, or we want the biggest congregation. Some churches may. It's not so much that we want that, but that the larger congregation is indicative of something that you're doing right. It must be, because else the people wouldn't come. People will come to church, you see, if you invite them, and if you form relationships with them. Relationships that they can rely on, relationships that they can trust. Then people can be introduced or reintroduced to God as the one that really we are relying on and getting to rely on and trust more and more. But trust, you see, is an issue for the world, and trust is an issue for many people in the church. And trust is a huge issue for many people who have left the church. And because the church is no longer the only place, or it's no longer the natural place for the community at large to gather, becoming part of church, becoming part of a church community has to be a subjective experience. It has to be a relational experience. Something needs to happen between me and the person I'm inviting to come and hear the good news in this particular way. And so it's you inviting someone to be part of what you know to be special, and what you know to be real. How people will experience it, we don't know, unless we invite them and they try. But for the thing for us in the church is, how will we experience good relational interaction? How will we learn to rely on people, to trust people, unless we experience that with one another in the church first, with those in the community? And that's what Jesus was getting at, if we were just to focus on the core of the gospel that we read today from Matthew chapter 23 and those first 12 verses. Jesus was challenging his fellow Jews about how they related to him and how they related to one another. They had just, in a mean sort of way, tried to catch him and said to him, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment? And he said, well, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. He quoted from the law. And then he added a bit, and he quoted from Leviticus, and he said, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes on to chastise the scribes and the Pharisees. And what he's really saying to them is, but you're not even doing it among yourselves. And you're not even doing it to me. And you're Jew and I'm Jew. And then he makes that statement, the greatest among you will be your servant. You see, serving people leads to increased faith. I wonder if we know that. Serving people leads to trusting relationships. There's nothing like curing my misery if I'm feeling miserable, or my self-focus, as we might often get into. There's nothing to cure that like going to serve somebody who has a deeper need and a very particular need, like going to the soup kitchen and serving those who maybe are not appreciating what's happening around at all. And so God says to us, come on, come with me and do service with me. Come and do, and then watch how I build community, because always we might do the inviting, but it is God the one that does the converting. And it's God the one who builds the community, not us. You see, people out there can't catch the picture if we don't do it among ourselves first, and then begin to do it with them. And today, of course, because it's not about the big church, but about the small group. And so even the most successful, very large congregations are congregations that have mastered the art of having people meet in small groups. And so it's almost small church within big corporate church. That's how people want to do it today. They want to be able to talk about the thing in intimate relationship. They want to be able to argue the thing out with somebody in a small group. And so if we are to attract people to forgiveness, and if we attract people to love, and if we attract people to faith communities, then we're going to have to attract them to our homes as the basis of that community, of the place where it happens, where we live out Christian family life, where we live out Christian family values, where we pray together, where we say grace together and teach our kids about the faith, and where the children who come and play with your children notice what you do, and they notice whether you say prayers, and they notice whether you sit at the table, and they notice whether you have community, and when they come and sleep over, they notice whether you say prayers with your children or not. And they go home and they tell their mums and their dads, wow, at their house they pray before they eat. And people feel that. They feel that in Christian people's homes. But of course we won't be able to do that to people outside the body, outside the church, if we don't go to one another's homes, and if we don't invest time in being in one another's homes and aiding that process of being the place of prayer, being the place of community and family. So, for example, now in our congregation we have home group leaders in a number of training sessions, spending some weeks and months preparing how to facilitate smaller groups in homes, so that those can begin around the parish quite soon. And people, a little while from now, are going to be inviting people in geographical areas to come to a meal in their home, so that we can just be together and enjoy time together and eat together and drink together as Christian people. And then they're also going to invite people to be part of a smaller group in their homes. And at first, you see, we need to do that not with people who don't come to church, but we need to do that with people who do come to church, so that we are beginning to learn and experience what it means to live community life with one another and prove that we're trustworthy, and show people who don't trust God and don't trust the church that we'll partner with them, that we'll relate to them. But of course, we need to practice that first with those with whom we share the peace at the Eucharist. We need to practice it first with those with whom we share communion at the altar each week. This is not my story, but it's the story that I heard this week from Neil Michel talking at the diocesan conference. He's an Episcopalian priest from Dallas, and is also the rector of a parish there. And he says he regularly asks himself, would I go to this church if they didn't pay me? Yeah, good question for the pastor to ask. What would make me come here, he says to himself often about the church where he's the rector. Would they care for me? Would they talk to me? Would they love me? Would they pray for me? What are the relationships like inside? Do they look like they care for each other? Do they practice that they love each other? Would I go here? Would I want to go here? It's proven that in our world, the majority of new people come to church because somebody else invites them. Someone who belongs to that place and enjoys that place says, come and see what we do. We've got a nice community here. And so if you're the kind of person who says, well, I like my church, but I wouldn't invite my friends there, what are you saying? What's the point? Why are you doing it? You know, you can get company, you can get love, you can get service from belonging to the SPCA, from belonging to the Legion, to the drama class, the art class, whatever. And so Christians have to ask ourselves, what is it that I invite other people to? Is it shared life? Is it a life of service? Is it a life of forgiveness? It's eternal life. And it's eternal life that begins now, not just when we die one day, but am I aware of what I'm inviting people to? You know, there's no more assurance in society that people know the Christian story. In fact, people don't know the Christian story. And the only place that they will hear the Christian story is from you and from me. And so you'll not be confident to learn the Christian story or to tell the Christian story unless you're learning the story and getting strength from the body that tells the story with you, from the group where you learn. And so when St. Paul talks about this inner relationship between the parts of the body in his letter to the Corinthians that we read just now, he's saying if the church is healthy, then we have to face our responsibilities to one another. And those responsibilities come in different ways. And so he says, well, using an analogy, if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, would it for that reason be any lesser part of the body? Or if the foot were say, but I'm not a hand, would that in any way mean that for that reason the foot is not part of the body? He says, if you're baptized into the body, he says just a few verses after that, if you're baptized into the church and you're part of that body, then there's a kind of dedication that I have to the rest of the church. I have a connection, I have an association with the rest of the body, with my abilities and my gifts. But I also have a dedication. Last week we used the word devotion. I also have a devotion to the rest of the body. I have a commitment to the body too, from which I can't just pull out when I don't feel like it, or if the Halloween party comes up, or if there's something more exciting, or whatever. So how do we handle both the association that I have with the body and then the dedication that I have to the body? How much can we rely on one another? I mean, if I were to ask us, how much can we trust one another in this body? Can we be available to the other? Or do we change our minds and choose other things above the other? You see, there's a difference between belonging to the church, you know, as building or as noun or as place, and belonging to my sisters and brothers in the church. There's a difference between those two things. If we're building church family, then the family have some servant attitude toward each other. Will they be there? Will they be there if I'm in crisis? Will they be there if I'm lonely? Will they be there if I'm sick? If I'm jobless? And we can't do that for others in the name of Christ if we don't do it for each other here, inside first. Because you see, it's in the body who prays together and the body who worships together that we also say the confession together. And that confession might be with each other and to each other. And real relationships begin when people hurt one another and when they forgive one another. And I suspect that sometimes we Christians are a little afraid of that. And as long as we can keep the body out there, as long as we can keep the church just out there, then we can be sure that maybe we won't be hurt by them. And then, of course, we won't have to forgive. But real relationships do hurt, and real relationships do forgive. And that's the reality of it. Commitment means learning spiritual responsibility to each other. Will there be a choir? Will there be someone to greet me? Will there be someone to preach? Will there be someone to read? Will there be someone to support? Will there be someone to care? Will there be someone to teach my children when I come here? Will there be children when I come here? Will the church be there when my child needs prayer? Will the church be there when my parents die? Will the church be there when I'm out of work? And that question means, will I be there for you? And will you be there for one another? Forming commitment to each other in the church is a hard thing. And the risk is, will we do it for each other? Only then, you see, can we risk inviting other people in. Because we've practiced doing it with one another. And unless we invite others in, of course, our faith doesn't grow, and then they will never know the forgiveness that we know. and the service that we know that Jesus offers. So I suppose, saying that, I also need to lay myself out there. And so if I say to you as a community, when you've needed me as priest, have I been there? You have to answer that. So do I. If you've told me about your need, have I visited you? Have I prayed for you? Do you think that I am committed to you? Don't answer. Fire him if he doesn't do it. Huh? So God asks you and me the same. Will we be there for each other? Will we risk trusting in the church? Will we risk relying on our sisters and brothers in the church? Will we notice the other All Saints members who live in our neighborhoods? And will we risk meeting them in their homes? Will we go and be with them? Will we make the effort to be with them above the other things that we want to do in life? You know, our church story here in Fort McMurray is of people who 100 years ago didn't count the cost. There was nothing. And they came down the river and planted and stayed and worked together and loved and established the church so that today we have Sunday school, so that today we have building. And if you go to Ontario or Montreal, then 400 years ago, people did the same thing. They planted the church, they stayed, and they committed to each other. Next week, commitment to your neighbor. And the big question, well, who's that? The third of the commitments.